So before we launch into hearing some of our amazing speakers and content today, I'm just going to give you a very quick background to Centre for Cultural Value. I know a lot of you, I've seen you at other events and in other discussions, will know a little bit about us, but just in case, for those of you who are new, just say Centre for Cultural Value, based here at the University of Leeds, but with many other academic partners as well, has been funded for 5 years until 2024 by Arts and Humanities Research Council, Arts Council England, and the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. So very grateful to those three generous funders. But I should also say that we are also supported by a fantastic and fast growing network of associate organisations, partners, academic partners, but also other partner organisations we're working with, and people like you, are some fantastic supportive community of practitioners across the cultural sector and the academy. The purpose of the centre is to develop a shared understanding of the difference that arts, culture, heritage and screen make on people's lives and of course on society. So the social value of engagement with culture. We campaign for the use of rigorous research and evidence in both cultural practice and in policy. And I suppose we do really see ourselves here as being here to support you and your work together. So you'll know, some of you, that there's a really big growing bank of resources. We started off, just not quite 2 years ago, and in that time we've built up a fantastic set of resources, research insights, digests, free online resources, events like this. We just launched our Collaborate seed funding programme to actually support inventive and interesting evaluation projects. In our last year, we're going to be launching a MOOC. And actually, there are lots and lots of opportunities now to debate and discuss questions of cultural values, some of which are attaching to this strand around the evaluation principles, and we'll be talking about later. In short, the door is open. If you're not already signed up to one of our many communications and newsletters, do please. It's the first step in opening up those conversations. We want you to join us in this endeavour of understanding the role that culture plays in our lives. So you can hear then that all of this work rests in some way on the process and principles of evaluation, hence our discussions here today. I should also tell you that in the early days of the centre, some of you were involved, we did a wide consultation with people working across all our sector bodies, all our sectors of interest, the cultural sector itself, academics working in the field, and also policy makers in the field. And we asked people what they were most interested in. And as well as wanting access to great insight and evidence about cultural value, the majority of people said they were interested in support in the actual business of evaluation. So obviously some sense in which evaluation may have been in crisis in our sector, and an interest in talking about what that was. So while we definitely didn't feel that it was our job to teach evaluation as such, we felt that we could be a platform for debate about its purpose, its positioning, and the evolving practice. So today we really want to start to explore that contribution. We want it to be a very public kind of debate, and we very much think it's our debate, not our collective debate, not particularly of just the Centre for Cultural Values. So, is evaluation a dirty word? I think lots of you here, I know, are fellow evaluators, and you will share the view that it is the engine of learning and innovation rather than being a dirty word. But if you still use it in a slightly negative way, I hope that by the end of today's session, you will be a bit closer to changing your mind. There's no doubt, of course, that evaluation and evaluators have been, misused, misunderstood, abused, underused. And today I hope we're going to launch some kind of a crusade to address those kind of questions. Anyway, so without more ado, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the structure of the event. First of all, we're going to have some big picture thinking from 4 amazing guests who are going to lay down a gauntlet to make us start thinking about the subject. And then we're going to have a short break, quick chance to rush away and do whatever you might need to do before we come back to hear more about the principles, how we made them, and what difference we think they're going to make. So let me move on to introduce then our 4 kickoff speakers, provocative I hope, who are going to be giving us some so-called lightning talks, and they're going to be talking about what evaluation looks like in an ideal world. There's already seen those great comments coming up on the screen at the beginning, so I think some really interesting debate ahead of us from all of us, not just our 4 fantastic speakers. They are Grace Bremner from Creative Civic Change, Kully Thiarai from Leeds 2023, Kati Price from the Victorian Albert, and Rishi Coupland from the British Film Institute, and they're going to talk to us in that order. Grace, are you ready? While you're getting, I think you've got a couple of slides, while you're getting ready to do that, can I just encourage you, do please put questions, comments in the chat. I'm going to be looking at it. Hopefully, if you're willing to talk to a point, I might put you on the spot and ask you to pop up on the screen. Grace, you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Should be. I'm just going to do it like this.
Brilliant.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. As my provocation, I'm going to be really taking the spirit of the brief and going big. And I wanted to share a storytelling device that we've created within the Creative Civic Change programme, which is really helping us think about our work. And in the hope that it will help you think about how to create a much better and more positive evaluation culture for the future. So to give a bit of background, Creative Civic Change is an experimental funding programme devised and supported by the National Lottery Community Fund, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, Kalous Gulbenkian Foundation and Local Trust. Together, we set out to experiment with how community creativity can be funded in a way that most meaningfully transfers power directly to communities. We give long-term, place-based funding directly to 15 communities and trust them to do amazing things with it. Our communities are in charge every step of the way, and we try our best to make every element of our programme community-led, including our evaluation. Over the past year, our communities have been struggling with the stark contrast between the size of their ambitions, hopes, dreams, capabilities for their places, and their comparatively tiny funding pots, resources, time, energy. The outcomes they've been working towards are things like happier, healthier, more connected communities, none of which can be achieved overnight or within a 4-year funding programme. It was in conversations about these very frustrations that the idea of a 100-year plan was born. What if communities were no longer bound to the life cycle of a funding programme or project, but to the much larger and expansive timeline of their community? What if we were all working for 100 years' time, for 3 generations forward? And importantly, how could funders, evaluators, organisations and local authorities support them to think in these terms? To support this, Anna Francis and Rebecca Davis from the Portland Inn Project, one of our communities in Stoke, developed a storytelling device, the CCC Garden, to help us think in this much wider context. Anna and Rebecca developed this idea from a project they had been running in their own community. I'll post a link in the chat to tell you more about their work. In their work, they've taken inspiration from the garden designer, Capability Brown. During lockdown, their community spent a lot of time visiting Trentham Gardens, a Capability Brown landscape nearby. Whilst they were there, they were struck with the vision Brown needed to create these landscapes. He planted oak trees as saplings, never to see them fully grown. He designed his landscapes to offer small moments of joy, like the smell of a rose, as well as the big picture, how the garden fits within the landscape, how it is seen from up high. Anna and Rebecca proposed this way of thinking to the CCC groups. If your community is a landscape, what are the things that need planting? What needs to be nurtured? How can you support the small moments and the grand plans? Over the course of a few sessions, our areas have talked about how many community arts projects that get funding end up being like the annuals, the busy Lizzies, the big show that dies off after the summer, only to have to be dug up and leave without a trace. What if instead these communities focused on perennials, the plants that come back time and time again? Or how can we make sure to collect the seeds as they die back? They talked about their own projects being more like self-seeders, the nasturtiums from which one seed in one pot can suddenly spring up in every crack available, coming back year after year. They talked about the importance of the compost heap, the potting table, the nursery, the places where ideas are developed and seeds are allowed to grow, the messy things that don't necessarily attract the funders, but are vital to the health of the environment. They talked about community leaders being like dahlias. They bloom beautifully, but need to be taken care of, dug up in the winter and stored away from the cold. Not everyone can be visible all the time. Allowing space for the communities to think within this framework has allowed them to accept the multiplicity involved in running projects like theirs, that magic exists in the acorns and the oak trees, and that creating a world in which all of these strands can be held and nurtured together is going to help their work thrive. So my question to you is, how can you think about evaluation in this framework? How can we think about the small moments and the big moments in order to create an ideal evaluation ecosystem? I have put together some provocations of what evaluation might be in this ecosystem, but I would love to hear your input too. Where is evaluation merely a label, something that translates magic into a funder's language, like a horticultural label translates plants into Latin? Where is evaluation like a hoarding, something to put logos on, something to obstruct the view and hide what's happening behind? But where is evaluation like a seed packet, something that contains everything you need to make a project grow elsewhere and to share that knowledge with others? Where is evaluation like a biodiversity survey, something that's capturing information to help preserve the landscape for years to come? These are just some of examples of what evaluation could be, but I think what I want to leave you with is that to really thrive, evaluation has to be all of these things, and it has to be contained within a landscape, rooted within it, and be born out of it rather than something that's introduced from outside. And yeah, that's what I'm going to leave you with there.
Grace, that's absolutely brilliant. What a lot of lovely plant-based metaphors you've given us to kick off. I've got all of them buzzing in my head: dahlias, seed packets, perennials. Thank you, fantastic. Brilliant. Can I now hand over another view on evaluation in an ideal world to Kully? Where are you? We lost you. Well, look, do you mind, Kati, would you mind stepping in to Kully's shoes while we've
no problem.
Thank you. Kati from the V&A.
Thank you. So today I'm actually celebrating my 8-year anniversary at the V&A. That's where I head up digital media and publishing. My team makes digital content, digital products and experiences that help tell stories about the 2 million objects in the V&A's incredible collections. So when I started all those years ago, I was involved in a capital programme that shall remain nameless with an external funder that shall remain nameless. And without revealing any state secrets, it involved creating a digital thing, an app no less, that, to be honest, should never have been proposed. Why? Because there was plenty of research within our sector that already existed that said people don't use museum apps. But that's what we're committed to. Luckily for us, this funder had supported an approach that involved both formative and summative evaluation. These were new terms for me, because I came from the world of digital development, which doesn't frame things in this way. We make digital products, services, experiences, and we make them for people. Before we even begin, we talk to those people about their needs, their interests, their behaviours, to understand what we're proposing, to see if it's even a thing. That's called user research. So once we've established that it is indeed a thing, we then use a very iterative approach to test what we're designing and building as we design and build it. That's called user testing. I guess that's more closely related to formative evaluation, in the sense that you're finding out from people whether the thing you're creating for them is hitting the right notes. And if it's not, making sure that you change your approach to better meet those needs, or sometimes stopping what you're doing altogether. So the very thought of waiting till the very end and doing what I now know of as summative evaluation is anathema. It's risky, dangerous even. Why would you commit time and energy and money, in this case public money, on designing and building something you don't even know that people want? But it's not to say we don't do summative evaluation, but summative evaluation feels like an endpoint, and most digital products and experiences and services have a long lifespan. They change, pivot, adapt over time. It's not a yay, we launched it, did it work moment. It's more about whether we hit the right goals, and those goals are about user value and about business value. And if we've not achieved those things, what are we going to do to improve our product? So evaluation isn't an end goal in itself, it's a tool to keep refining what you do. But if I'm honest, I do struggle a bit with the term evaluation, and that's because most definitions of evaluation seem to involve some sense of judgment. And I've done some Googling about this. So according to the Collins Dictionary, if you evaluate something or someone, you consider them in order to make a judgment about them, for example, about how good or bad they are. And according to the Cambridge Dictionary, it's the process of judging or calculating the quality, importance, amount, or value of something. And it's this sense of judgment that I think can often hold us back. It's one that can introduce a sense of fear around the idea of evaluation. I think the notion of assessment is a much more useful and a more positive lens through which to think about evaluation. It's one that supports a learning approach where you're not judging failure as a bad thing, but instead assessing the fact that perhaps this time it didn't work. And why is that? And more importantly, asking yourself, so how might we change it to make it more impactful, more successful, more meaningful next time, next week even? After all, failure is a necessary part of any creative endeavour, and alongside ambiguity, one that needs to be embraced. So I think there are three important aspects about evaluation that I'd like to leave you with. I believe evaluation should be less about judgment and more about assessment. That's the only way we'll learn from what we've done well alongside what we've not done so well. It should drive insights that help us to do things better. Evaluation should involve people at the earliest stage and frequently, engaging with them at the outset, engaging with them equitably, engaging with them meaningfully. An evaluation should be iterative, so that we don't leave it to the end as some sort of summative exercise, but use it to keep learning and improving and refining what we do. So in case you're wondering, did we make that museum app? No, we bloody didn't. We used research to suggest that our digital efforts were better spent on creating brilliant content that could be delivered to people through the web in a more accessible, relevant way. And we had a funder who listened, who was hearing similar from other projects at that time and was receptive, which is hugely important. So ultimately, we saved a lot of money on not building a thing that no one wanted and instead made something with more value. But that would never have happened if we didn't listen to previous research, hadn't listened to people throughout the process, the people who are ultimately going to use the product, and if we hadn't been brave in having those conversations with our funder. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'm so glad to know about the happy ending to that story. So fantastic. Yeah, it's very nice. So people, iteration, less about judgment, more about assessment. Kully, I know that was a bit scary there. Your internet dropped out, but you're back. Your floor's yours.
And hopefully it won't drop out now. So I'll move to space, but it's totally unpredictable, isn't it? So yeah, thanks for bearing with me. Hello everyone, and I'm Kully Thiarai, and as Anne said, I'm the Creative Director and CEO of Leeds 2023. And for those of you who might not know anything about Leeds 2023, just in a context, it's the city committing to deliver a year of culture when because of no longer being eligible to be to bid for European Capital of Culture, the sort of journey to this point led everyone to say we're going to do it anyway. So it's my job to try and deliver on that promise, which is both exciting and terrifying in equal measure on many days. Anyway, so I thought, I know that there's lots of brilliant people in the room, and others will talk much more eloquently than I about the sort of theory of change and the mechanics of evaluation frameworks and the core principles. So I hope you'll forgive me, but I thought I'd talk about it from a bit of a personal perspective, if I may. And part of that is linked to the fact that I am a theatre maker. That's been what I've been doing for a very long period of time. So I thought I'd kick off with what it goes on for me when I'm making a piece of work and I've finished a piece of work, and the kind of reflective practice sometimes that puts you through. And the first thing to say is that I am never satisfied with the end result. It doesn't matter how brilliant the reviews are or how an extraordinary experience it might have been for people. It takes me quite a long time to be able to look back and go, I did that well, because quite often it's all the things that you didn't manage to achieve that prey on your mind, or things that you kind of haven't quite landed, that sort of make you constantly question whether you'd approached it right, or you'd, what else you could have done differently. And those moments of joy when the audience are connecting with a piece of work are brilliant, but that nevertheless doesn't stop you from interrogating all of the choices and the decisions and the frameworks and the ways in which you might have done things other. And of course, as somebody said earlier, actually it's through the things that you didn't do well, which actually is the thing that helps you refine your practice or make you really consider what you were trying to achieve and why it didn't work. And of course, those variables change from show to show, from project to project, from place to place, from different groups of people. So it's not always an easy calculation, I suppose, around, oh, well, if I do X, then Y will happen this time, because when I did X last time and it, you know, this didn't happen or this did happen. So of course, any interaction around making a piece of certainly theatre involves a load of other people, a load of other variables, and it's always going to have a level of organicness to it. And it, but there's sort of emotional connection to the product is really important, whether that's you as the director of a piece or the performers in the show, or, you know, indeed the audience experiencing it. And, you know, so I think for me, that sort of speaks to a very core principle around how do we make an assessment around the emotional connection someone is making? Because of course, how things touch you will really, really vary depending on the lens through which you're seeing the world and the story unfolding in front of you. And also the sort of the shoes that you're stepping into, if you like. So I always think about, you know, theatre experiences being like an opportunity to kind of have a dress rehearsal for life, to try and sort of sit in someone else's shoes and see the world from a slightly different place. But, you know, if there is only ever a sort of singular perspective on our stages or in our sort of cultural canon, whatever that might be, then of course, the lens with which we look at it will vary, will mean that some people won't connect with it emotionally in the way that you perhaps would have intended. And I wanted to sort of give an example of that, which is, and it's quite an old example now from many years ago, when I was artistic director at Leicester Haymarket Theatre, and we did a Christmas production of Wizard of Oz. And the Good Witch was played by a wonderful actress called Sarah Niles, who's a Black performer. And I was sitting in the auditorium. There's a row of children, probably about 8 or 9 years old, big school group, quite a mixed group of kids, mostly, but this one young lad at the end, who's a young Black lad, and the Good Witch arrives onto the stage on this sort of crescent moon, flies in, and you know, it was a very beautiful moment. But the most interesting thing was they all leaned forward, but the row of kids just turned around and looked at this young Black lad, and you literally saw him grow in his seat. So how do you value that? How do you assess that? How do you understand that? And of course, part of that is to do that he was watching something where it was the villain on stage wasn't Black. There was a beauty to a character that looked like him, and there was something joyful that he was experiencing. And of course, it's hard to make lots of judgments about that, but that is an important example of where it does really matter around the choices one makes and the kind of points of emotional connection that people are making with any piece of work. At the opposite end of the spectrum was a long time, again, a very long time ago, but it stayed with me and it's really played on my mind about how one evaluates and how one makes approaches to evaluation, because of course we understand that the need for the importance of that. Was a major Arts Council funded evaluation program, which was very creative and very, you know, very focused on this project that was very young people focused. But it meant that after every single event or show, you were given stickers and you had to do vox pop type responses. You couldn't leave the auditorium without putting a sticker and valuing what you'd just seen. And whilst it was useful on one level, what happened was that the cumulative impact was that you started going, how can I get out of this space without having to do any of this? because actually it was taking away from something you'd really, you'd experienced, but not loads of people weren't ready to talk about it yet, or if they were, that wasn't the mechanism that they wanted to use. So there's something about the appropriateness around the choices one is making. I mean, I could go on forever, but I suppose I'm conscious of time. But I guess the thing I'm alluding to really is about the question of complexity and difference, and how do we work out what is happening for an individual in an experience when they're so engrossed in something and might not wish to talk about it for days or weeks, or indeed it might take years later. And I'm fortunate in knowing a few artists who experienced something when they were teenagers who are now working in the industry, and for whom a singular experience had been the turning point for them. So, you know, an international, one of our renowned poets who happened to see a theatre with a mixed cast in his local youth club, where in a world where he was largely the only Black young man, you know, for example, or a creative artist who, you know, responded to me being in part of a creative team in her school and going, I want to be like her. So there's loads of things that actually perhaps the wider sense of evaluation we don't talk about, but those small stories are big stories, in fact, because that is the impact of the things that we do that make a difference to people. So how do we deal with that complexity? And I guess, what are we evaluating for? You know, who are we evaluating for? The creatives, the public, the funders. You know, we say we want to use it as learning, but do we really use it as learning? Do we really talk about the failures? Because we're so, you know, so sort of pushed to kind of shouting about our successes, but actually it's the failure that actually has true learning attached into it. And that's very hard to do when the context of the operating models are so competitive and so judgmental at times, you know. So it's very, very hard to admit when things go wrong, but that is a critical part of the analysis of getting better and thinking ahead. And ultimately, what's the story we're trying to tell, and how does evaluation help us both define our approach to achieving our objectives and measuring them, and what is the change we are trying to make, and how will we know when we've made a difference? And those are the kind of big questions we're asking about Leeds 2023. You know, what is the change we want to make? And some of that we might know, you know, 6 months after the event, but some of that change is not going to be visible for 10, 20, 30 years. So how do we assess the longitudinal impact, the qualitative impact of an experience? So I think that note about assessment is really useful, but also about what is the change we would like to see and what does it look like feels really important. So, and finally, I would say things I would constantly look at is, let's consider the rigor, the appropriateness of the methodology for different elements of assessment. Let's think about and value the creative reflective practice around constantly checking and rechecking what it is you're doing in the process of making something. And let's look at how we, you know, embrace ongoing learning and manage that complexity and difference in meaningful ways, and really think about how best we share that, so that, you know, there's multiple ways of learning being exchanged. I think I'll shut up there, and I hope that.
No, that's absolutely brilliant, and thank you very much, because it's a beautiful through line. I think, as several people are mentioning, very good synthesis here in the chat, but that through line through the, you know, beyond generation idea that Grace was talking about, and the organic side of it, and then Kati talking about the people side of it. I think this idea that evaluation requires emotional intelligence is super important, because we tend to think about, you know, we use the word rigor and we think that means in some way that's rather sort of quite left brain way of thinking about things. And I think it's really important to think about the emotional impact of whether that's about judgment or indeed the experiences that people are having. So I think it's a really, really important dimension to bring in, and nicely shaping up a nice 360 view. Rishi, you have the last word.
Yeah, I do. Why should I talk to you about evaluation? Because I've seen the delegate list, and most of you know more about evaluations, carrying them out or managing them than I do. And I think the reason I've got something to say is because in my life, I've driven a crane and I've fixed some planes. I've settled on that's why I should talk to you about evaluations. So I'll explain a little bit about my background and cranes and planes. So my first job that wasn't working in a shop was I worked for British Airways, and I fixed planes for British Airways. And then after that, I was an engineer, and I went and worked on construction projects. And what links those two things? I mean, any of you who might have read the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande will maybe have seen the connection. They're the two parts of industry that have done the most to get their house in order in terms of the aviation industry decided years ago that it was not acceptable for planes to fall out of the sky, and changed everything about the way they ran and the entire culture in order to prevent that happening. And it's still, if you ever, when having worked in it, it's an extraordinary culture to work in. There's issues with it, but in terms of how absolutely everything runs to, in a tight margin business, to stopping planes falling out of the sky, it's amazing. And the construction industry, buildings don't fall down, and similarly, it's a culture thing. So I grew up my career terms in cultures that were progressive plain speaking, incredibly plain speaking to the point of fixing problems, with a ruthless commitment to change and a unifying culture. That's what I grew up in. And I've seen people who were at the lowest level of temps write up plant managers and senior people for their behavior because it wasn't safe. And that's absolutely fine. And people don't get sacked or censured for that. That's my background. Then I came to the culture sector, which isn't like that. Maybe is in places, but progressive plain speaking, not really. Unifying culture, not really. Ruthless commitment to change, not by my standards. So those are some of the issues in where there's a good intention, but we don't have those tools to change. So maybe evaluations are the sort of antidote to this. Evaluations are how we make change happen in the culture sector. Well, maybe, but I'll tell you what I've experienced. Earlier this year, I did a research project where I interviewed change makers in the culture sector. Some of them have been involved in the work since Black Lives Matters. Some of them working on some of the highest profile change projects in the country. Some of them working in a very small way around digital or young people or race or all kinds of things like that. And one thing I can say from having spent quite a lot of time interviewing them and all the trials and tribulations they had, all the barriers to change, all the slights, degradations, lack of knowledge passed to them that they'd had to deal with, is not a single one of them ever spoke about evaluations as being something that helped them, something that gave them succor, something that gave them guidance. And and a lot of the feedback I got, I know, was things that they could not say to an evaluator. It's based on trust. So there's a disconnect there. I know that between the work of on-the-ground change makers and what evaluations do, and where the information, the potential for evaluation to inform change and whether it reaches people, there's a disconnect there. And then I also spoke to people at the senior leaders, people like Kully, actually, people with very, very good aspirations to change the sector and in a leadership position, which is great. And they said things like, evaluations are great, but they very rarely tell me something I didn't know. They said things like, when evaluations recommend change, there's a defensiveness to the organization, and we lack a third space for people to step back into in order to look at their own work and absorb criticism and take it in place. So lack of a third space. Oh, they say things like, when they're actually in the, really confronted with urgent needs to change, I never heard this, I wasn't aware of this, despite having presided over evaluations. So there's a disconnect maybe between senior leaders and what they should be hearing from evaluations as well. And I boiled that down to three things. I think sometimes evaluations are not saying the things that need to be said for whatever reason in order to drive the changes that are necessary in the context in which we're operating. I don't necessarily think evaluations prepare organizations for the work after the evaluation, which is where they discuss the change that's necessary. And that's third space. I sometimes refer to that as a questioning culture. And thirdly, what audience are evaluations written for? Are they written for change makers? Are they written for the kinds of senior leaders who want to make change happen, but just, although they have power, need some impetus? Are they written for financial directors? Are they written for the boards? I kind of feel it verges more towards the latter than those former set, certainly in my experience. So there's an audience thing there. So I think that all of those things should be addressed in an ideal world. And I keep coming back to the idea of the questioning culture. How can evaluations sit alongside a culture in an organization where people can absorb the knowledge from evaluations and run with it to make change happen? And if you're creating evaluations for organizations which don't have a questioning culture, what's the point? What actually will happen as a result? And so isn't it just as important to build the questioning culture and the third space as it is to create better evaluations? And whose job is that? Is that funders? Is that organizations? Is that evaluators? I don't know, but I think it's important. Having grown up in a world with that culture, I took it for granted. Right, I've got four recommendations that I would give, really practical ones to people writing evaluations from my perspective. And by your usual caveats, I'm probably wrong. Oh, and a big caveat, by the way, I've just taken on board a very, very good evaluation manager into the BFI who's going to educate me into all the ways evaluations are good and that I've missed. So if I feel like what I'm saying is harsh, that's partly through ignorance, and I will become more learned about evaluations over the next few months. So first thing, try and ensure that evaluations happen in a questioning culture, and there's clever things you can do about that. I think if someone wrote a guide to exec directors and CEOs saying, here's what you should do before starting an evaluation, then evaluation companies could point to that guide and say, oh, by the way, are you following these principles for having a questioning culture or a third space? I'd love to see in evaluations more frameworks from outside the culture sphere, like I talked about, I'm used to from my sort of grease monkey days as an engineer. I'd love things I was used to be seeing: Kaizen, which came from the Japanese world of car making; Six Sigma, which is, I mean, Victorian, so it's problematic in that sense, but interesting about how to improve things. Human factors from the world of aviation; HAPA from the world of health; the Stoke framework for change in education sectors; and Schwartz's psychological approach to change. I'm not very well read, actually, and yet I know all these frameworks exist in the outside world. I'd love to see them referenced, or whatever you think is important, referenced in evaluations that are not always from the cultural sphere. Please, maybe just try framing. How would your evaluation look if it was designed to speak to and reach cultural agitators? What about them? Let's look at a different frame from the usual one. And how can it, because if all these change makers are not really hearing or finding stuff in evaluations that helps them in the business of change making, let's do something about that. And the fourth thing is, I'm not a professional report writer, and you doing evaluations are. So my plea would be to educate me, write or present your evaluations in a way that surprises me and really engages me. And I go, oh, I didn't realize you could write reports or present them. Maybe the garden approach, that the 100-year plan that was talked about, might surprise me. You know, I use bring techniques and skills to presenting information that really bring me up a level as a reader, because I'd love to see that in evaluations as well. So there we go. That's everything I've got to say. And I guess the unifying thing is, question I've got is, if evaluations didn't exist, they never existed, this concept, and we were starting from scratch, what would we make? Would it be a kind of formal report? Would it be more about a questioning culture? What would it look like if they didn't already exist? That would be my question back to you all.
Right, everybody hold that question in your head. It's a fantastic one. I'm just going to say, I was about to observe that you made a point about evaluation, that, you know, evaluation or evaluations, you know, a sort of a noun or a sort of an object or a process kind of idea. But actually, Christina in the chat has made the point much better than I could have done. So thank you very much. That's a great observation. But I think, you know, I already feel the debate called the third space coming on, Rishi. So I think this idea, that's a brilliant idea that you left us with. How do we create a questioning culture? Because surely, actually, that's what really lies behind our question, is a fantastic big picture way of thinking about the issues here. And indeed, Douglas agrees with me. Well, there you go. Agrees with it. There's a consensus here. Now, we are running a little tiny bit behind time, but has anybody got any specific? We've got some really great discussion boiling up here in the chat, but would anybody actually like to ask any specific questions while we do? I do encourage you to have a look. I think there's also, we've got this a long list of other evaluation frameworks to have a look at. I really like that. And I think you talked about the checklist manifesto is another useful reference point. Actually, spread our wings and think differently. As we've said, Centre for Cultural Value, we don't particularly want to say there's one way of doing these things, which is why we've been thinking about principles rather than a sort of a kind of a blueprint, if you like. So anybody got any particular questions they'd like to do? I think lots of encouragement, lots of things that people really liked here. Yes, the big question that you all asked, I don't know if anyone would like to comment on this, was who is evaluation for? And I will say that in the process of the co-creation of the evaluation principles themselves, this was the recurrent theme, who is evaluation for, really interestingly here. Would anyone like to comment on that at all?
We've had quite an interesting conversation about that recently, because at the beginning we really deliberately kind of stripped. We've got brilliant evaluators in Amanda Smepper, Sarah Boyling and Anusha Hagdali, so they're to credit for all of this, but they we deliberately kind of cleared everything off the slate that was for the funders and tried to really make it about the communities. And so all of the evaluation is built around them and their processes. But I think one of our big pieces of learning is what a lot of pressure that is for those communities. And now, as they are getting more confident and trying to tell the stories that usually funders, grantees could trust the funder to have information on and be sharing, we don't have that. So it's kind of yes, trust communities, do all of that, make it about the people, but you do sacrifice something.
But there's something quite interesting there about the concept that you might retrofit your findings for the funders rather than doing it the other way around. Yeah, so actually, pick up what you learned and choose the story you want to rather than being led by, I think is a really interesting approach. We've got some comments here. There's no one size fits all answer. I think this is what comes back again and again. Emily there, and I think there is a question here. How do you suggest this or positively change sectors funders who are very bent on using traditional evaluation frameworks? So I'm going to ask panel, I'm going to ask all of you a very, very quick comment on this before we just break. What would you do to challenge, in a good way, funders about their preference for traditional evaluation frameworks? You're kind of off the hook, I think, Grace, because you got us thinking about that. I
glitched and I just missed the end of that.
Oh, sorry.
The last bit, what the question is.
So the question is that's been posed by Joanna really is, what would you do to positively challenge funders who are bent on using traditional evaluation frameworks? What could we do? Let's better, not what would you do alone? What could we do together? There you go. Do you want to have a stab at that, Rishi? You're looking up at the remote.
Yeah, I think it's in my experience, and I guess BFI is a funder as well, it's worth saying. I think that funders are full of really good people who are really intelligent and with really good intentions. And sometimes it's the reason why one might feel that the message isn't, there's a lost message somehow with funders or feel frustrated, is because the act of funding is very, very difficult, and there's lots of diversions. So, I mean, I think it probably takes persistence to keep going. And also I would say not to assume, I mean, this is because it takes energy and that's really bad, but not to assume because you haven't, I mean, I must admit, I just think that sometimes the third email doesn't get a response and sometimes the fifth one does. So I think sometimes it's about keep pushing to get your voice heard. I mean, who has that energy? I don't know. But if you feel you're onto something that funders should hear about, then I do think they will listen over time, but we need to somehow build encouragement and persistence into people to try and get their message across. I mean, that's probably deeply unhelpful, and probably someone can come up with a better one. I mean, maybe the Centre for Cultural Value is a great advocate for these things.
And I think it's a really interesting point. And I've also that we've got quite a lot of funders with us today, I think, that come from bodies like that. And certainly the conversations that we've been having at CCV with funders is also asking the same question. It's like, why is the sector scared of the questioning culture? So I think there may be a mismatch of understanding, and Ben's just mentioned Layla and David Stevenson's great work on failure, by the way, which is really, really interesting in that thing. Thank you, Claire. I don't know if you would like to I don't know if you would you like, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, or would you just like us to look at your chat, but you're saying as a funder, we already approach our funding as a partnership relationship to encourage learning and reflective practice, but we often find our partners want a funders relationship as opposed to a partner dialogue. And actually what I think sometimes sitting between is often that people think they know what funders are saying to them without actually even perhaps sending the first email that asks the question. So I think there's something really interesting there. Right, guys, I'm going to suggest, if you've got any questions that you'd really like to ask, I think we're going to lose Kati shortly, but thank you so much, can I say to you before you do. But we're all going to be here for the rest of the discussion, so please keep those comments coming, and if you've got questions that you'd like to pose the panel to open up or indeed put to yourself, please put those in the chat. But I'm going to suggest we have a little break now. Can we come back at 3, please? Hello, welcome back. I'm going to hope that you, if you feel like it, put your camera on. So I've got a rough idea who's back, but let's kick off anyway, because I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction. So thank you all for engaging so intelligently with our very intelligent conversations so far. So now diving into the principles themselves, and I suppose a framework perhaps through which we can ask some of these very sophisticated questions around you know, a sort of sea change in the way we think about and can indeed conduct evaluation, and its place in the culture of our organisations and in our work. What we're going to do now is we're going to hear a little bit from Beatriz Garcia, one of the authors of the co-created evaluation principles. I'm going to let Beatriz and then Vish talk a little bit about the process. So Beatriz is going to tell us a little bit about the resource and our conception of it. Then Vish, who took part, one of the 40 people that took part in the co-creation process, is going to talk about what we were doing and what she thought of it. And then we're going to hear from Oliver and Beatriz, the people who actually had the unenviable task of going away and writing up all those different opinions about what's actually in there, and a little bit more about the concrete part of it. And again, we should have some time at the end for some discussion, and I can tell you a bit more about the many ways that we're going to be able to engage with these with the principles in the future. Okay, so Beatriz, the floor is yours, to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And here I am with my very shiny background, making the most of the bright colors of the Center for Cultural Value. And I have to say, actually, it was a real pleasure and a privilege to be working over the last year on what we're going to be sharing with you all now. If you have been exploring websites, you might have seen that obviously things have been published. But well, my brief right now is simply to recap about the why. Why did we embark on this exercise? And it's because, as what has been mentioned before, it's because you asked for it. The sector asked for it loud and clear. It was not going to be one of the kind of leading cornerstones for activity at the Center for Cultural Value when things were originally planned back in 2019. But after a whole series of conversations throughout the country, this was one of the really hot topics and key topics, which surprised me a little as someone that has been involved over 22 years on the evaluation processes, and often finding stakeholders being quite reluctant to engage, finding this a really frustrating process. So there has been a demand to say, how do we change this? How do we change our understanding and our engagement with an evaluation process from being seen as an imposition and as something that might affect our capacity to deliver what we want, into precisely the opposite, into an opportunity for learning, into an opportunity to actually think bigger. So the key here, and I was glad to hear the three previous speakers, is to realize that obviously there are plenty of examples of how the evaluation debate has evolved around the world and in other sectors. And we have many references that we can also consider. Here we have UNESCO, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of many, that have been developing evaluation policies, standards, criteria, all kinds of documents out there where they visualize and they work very clearly on developing a common language. So that's what we need within the culture sector in this country and throughout, is just to agree on the basics, on the keywords, what we mean by them, but also what came up very clear to us was also an expectation or a demand to have the opportunity to actually make unique contributions. Because as we have heard just in the first part of today, there are some needs that do not seem to be addressed completely, maybe because evaluation frameworks have been set with other priorities in mind. So actually, what is it that the cultural sector can add up to this conversation? So that we had plenty of tools to play with, and we have had a whole year and a bit. You're going to hear a bit more about how that experience was for those working with us within the working group. And this has resulted into the main themes and the 12 principles that we are proposing today, and that Oliver and I will run you through in a moment. So I hand over, I just stop sharing for the next brief presentation.
Thank you, lovely. And can I now hand over to Vish from Urban Lamp, just to tell us a little bit about the process, the co-creation process, and some of the delicious debates we had online and elsewhere.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone. I'm Vishalakshi Roy, or Vish. I have two roles. I'm director of Urban Lamp, but I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Warwick at the Centre for Cultural Media Policy Studies. I'm here today to talk to you about being part of the working group that co-created alongside lots of other colleagues from the sector these principles that we're talking about today. And when I was thinking about the presentation today, I thought, what's the best way of sort of summarizing the experience we had, and I came up with three quotes really that kind of helps capture my experience of being part of this exercise. So the first thing, it takes a village, and we were a village. I mean, we've been called worse, I'm sure, people who work in evaluation, but there was a group of just over 40 of us that took part in this exercise. Personally, for me, my journey started with the Centre for Cultural Value. I think this was an in-person event that I attended, so that must have been before the lockdown, so February 2019. I went to one of the roadshows where the Centre for Cultural Value talked about all the important work that was going to happen over the next 5 years. And in August 2020, an invitation went out to a large group of individuals to be part of this important working group. As I said, there's just over 40 individuals that took part, and lots of different ways in which we were consulted or we contributed to this exercise, primarily on Zoom, because obviously the world changed in the time that between the time that we decided to do this and when we actually did it. So there were many discussions and debates about nuances, about terminology, about shared experiences, and about our opinions on how evaluation happens, why it happens, who it's for, and some of the debates that we've just talked about this morning, this afternoon even. And also there was a lot of Mentimeter polls that Anne executed very efficiently. So a lot of Mentimeter has gone into making these principles that you're going to hear about today. But the thought I wanted to kind of encapsulate is the fact that it has taken a village full of people to come up with this, and it's not something that has taken any one person a lot of time. It's taken a lot of people a lot of time. The next bit I wanted to talk about, I was trying to come up with a quote which was about a shepherd and sheep, and it was getting all a bit too religious, so I decided to go with this one. There is no magic. The magic is in the details, and although what you're going to hear about today is beautifully encapsulated in probably 12 words or phrases, there is hours and hours of work that's gone into coming up with those. There were 3 half-day workshops that primarily consulted with the group, but in addition to that, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes work that Ben, Beatriz, Anne, and the team and all of us put into in bringing these together. I will risk being shouted at by the Centre for Value team to say that actually parts of the process was quite enjoyable for people like myself, especially people who like to engage with detail. I'm sure enjoyable is probably not the first word that would come to mind for the people who had to actually produce things to a deadline. But I think front and center throughout pulling all of that magic together was that we needed to come up with a set of principles that was relevant and useful and something that people would engage with, because obviously there was no point in doing this if it was just going to be another exercise that sort of sits on a shelf somewhere. So we've tried to factor all of that in. Obviously, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, which is what where we are at now. My apologies, that doesn't look much like pudding. I mean, it's far too healthy. But I think the main thing moving forward is that, you know, today we're kind of serving it up to you, and we're all yet to try them. So I think how they will work and the impact that they will have, it's on the sector is largely up to all of us. And we need advocates, but equally importantly, we need to listen to the cynics as well. We need some open discussions about how this will work in practice. We need lots of open conversations and sort of some sense and a spirit to collaborate and to share learning. And surprise, surprise, we need to evaluate these principles as well. And I'm very much looking forward to being part of that activity. And I sincerely hope that this group here is going to be part of that too. That's me.
Super, thank you, Vish. And just to say, of course, the process doesn't really stop here. I mean, one of the reasons we're sharing these, you know, we kept thinking about it being very much a draft, that the principles are never going to stand still. I think that's an important framing of them. We're assuming that we keep revising them. It's an ever, Ollie's looking a bit worried about that. It's an ever developing process, and it is a framework for debate, among other things. Oliver, are you next? My colleague Oliver Mantell from the Audience Agency is now going to actually finally, after we've set it up endlessly today, share some of those, share the 4 themes and the 12 principles.
I think I say a couple of words first, and then it goes to Ollie.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Just yes, and then he has the last word.
He has the last word.
But it's I'm really Thank you very much, Bish, and for everyone in the working group. Really, the level of engagement, it was fantastic, but obviously Ollie knows also the mountains of materials that also are on the back of this whole process, and things that we are going to be sharing and putting also online progressively in terms of background. But really what matters today was also about those key messages. Because I think what we keep hearing again and again is that issue around the common language and whether we can, as a sector, with all the diversity that any sectors represent and the different takes there, whether we can get to understand what we mean, while we make certain references. So here you have the 4 main themes that were identified. And that translates into 12 principles. So 3 principles that are loosely attached to each of these themes and that are all interrelated. We are going to present them one-on-one and see what you think. And we are very keen for you to comment on the chat, because there will be no time today to have a very detailed or in-depth conversation. Obviously, we have also a whole year to continue the interactions, but it is really great to see how you react as we present things. And we hope that you recognize many of the keywords or the concepts that were noted earlier on today here, and that you realize that actually they are quite well reflected. So yes, Ollie, the floor is yours. And let's start with the beneficial theme.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Yes, so with many of these, I think they really do resonate with the conversations we've had here today, in the same way that they kind of, we had some similar, some very intense debates as part of the working group. So the first of these, in terms of, and the broad theme in terms of being beneficial, we've talked a bit about the fact that evaluation has to be for something. You know, it's not just an exercise to be done for its own sake. And so that's really where this idea of being beneficial is from, but particularly we've started with this idea, particularly around the idea of it being about learning and or change. So we debated whether it was one or the other of those, or whether learning was a subset of change or whatever else. But essentially we're saying that it needs to be about doing something useful. So prioritizing learning over monitoring, and it really being about understanding, you know, what happened, why and how, and what does that mean, and you know, what you can do with it, as opposed to this kind of slightly black and white, was it good, was it bad, does it get a tick or not? So all sorts of different ways that we could look about that idea of learning and how we incorporate learning and iterate learning. But of course, when we talk about things being about change, that also implies that idea of kind of evaluation having to have a kind of time sequence to it. Now, we haven't put explicit times on that. We certainly haven't mentioned 100 years, but I love that idea. But certainly this idea that you have a kind of before, during and after, and this sort of some sense of change and then contributing to future change. So yeah, if we want to move on to our next one. So this, we talk about the need for it to be ethical. We again had a debate about whether this even needed saying. You know, is ethical one of those things that kind of goes without, doesn't need to be mentioned. But we decided it did, partly because there are so many ethical issues that are live when we deal with evaluation, that actually it sort of pays to be explicit about that, without necessarily pinning down a particular kind of ethical code. Although obviously we have referenced here the idea that there are professional standards and various other, you know, guidelines and things which can help kind of reinforce that. But really, beyond a kind of a broad sense of having an ethical framework and applying it with integrity, one idea that kept coming up was the idea that sort of evaluation at its worst can be quite exploitative. That essentially you have a kind of user group who contribute time or money or their ideas, their contacts, their hopes, and that can sometimes be kind of extracted, taken somewhere else, and then turned into an asset that can be used for funding bids or something else, but actually that it doesn't sort of nurture the whole community who are engaged in it. So that's why we're talking here about, you know, the benefits needs to be something that is recognizable and owned by everyone involved. So, you know, that includes especially the participants and users. And so it should be, evaluation should be supporting that whole system as opposed to being extractive in mindset. Okay, and on to the On to the third way in which we talk about it being beneficial. And again, we've talked a lot already so far today about the idea of applicability and using evaluation, and how you kind of turn it into action in the future. And it's not meant to be this kind of dead end sat on the shelf. And again, but that's one of the key strands here. Yes, it's about being used, and therefore it's about being made useful for and also deliverable to a wide range of people. But also that also implies that there are situations where evaluation is done where it can't be applied, and therefore there is a valid question about whether it should be being done at all. So it's possibly better to do less evaluation, deeper and better shared, than just lots of things which then can't really make an impact. We've also mentioned here about the idea of making sort of actionable recommendations. That clearly isn't always the case, but even just the mindset of thinking, if we've done this evaluation, if we've drawn certain conclusions, what does that mean? What does that, what will people do with that? Is quite a good kind of just discipline to encourage people to be sort of thinking in terms of, and therefore, what's the benefit? What's this leading to? Okay, so if that's the kind of different ways in which we talk about it being beneficial, one of the other key themes that came up numerous times is about the idea of robustness. If we can just move along, Beatrice, to the next one. So this isn't to say there isn't excellence of practice already happening, but maybe there are bits of the sector, or occasions where that's more or less the case. And certainly several people said to us that they thought that this idea of kind of robustness and rigor of approach was something that the whole sector could do with moving along a little bit further, particularly when people were looking at some of those sort of intersector comparisons. So we've talked here about the idea of rigor, and we need to be a little bit careful when we talk about rigor. We're not just talking about very particular stereotyped ideas of rigor, but that it should be to some extent empirical, based on actual facts. It's not just an opportunity to sound off or give opinions, and that those should be adequate to the conclusions drawn, and that it's okay not to know everything, or okay to be able to say, our evidence takes us so far, we think that might mean this, but we actually, the bit we can really pin down is this. And when I talked about that idea of, what we mean by rigor, different suitable methods will be applicable in different contexts. So it could be qualitative, it could be quantitative, it could be relatively formal, it could be informal. All of those things have their place, and at different points, they are the best and most rigorous tool to be using. So we're not saying that there is a kind of like one particular method that needs to be used. Although, of course, there's loads of good practice and experience and guidelines and standards about how to use different techniques. And obviously, as skilled evaluators, that's what should be being applied. And then this is the final point here about rigor, is this idea of replicability. Now, that's sometimes, that could be literally the whole process can be replicated, or it could be that on an analogous project, there's enough detail in the description of the methodology to allow that to be articulated or followed through. But it could also be looking at the analytical process and making sure that that's kind of transparent. So, these are the things, this is the evidence we chose to set aside. This is how we used it. This is how we grouped it, interpreted it. This is how we fed it back. So there's a kind of clear sense of what's being done. And it allows that then empowers people who are reading the evaluation to have their own view on the conclusions that were drawn, as opposed to just being told this is what the answer was. So that's a first part of being robust. The next one, which might be a sort of slight surprise, is the idea of open-mindedness as an aspect of robustness. And from that, I think it's about the fact that to really do justice to projects, situations, work, etc., it can't just be about a very preset, we're doing it this way, we're looking for this thing, that's all we're going to interpret. It has to be open to unintended outcomes, maybe different ways of gathering evidence, and more creative ways of gathering evidence, and some of those will be more appropriate to the kind of creative sectors. And therefore open to learning. We've already talked about failure as being an important thing to address, and that's something that I think is very much the heart of some of these conversations. we had a big debate about the extent to which we should be being partisan or not, and essentially said that our role or our purpose is to evaluate and learn and change. It's not about just acting as cheerleaders. That's more like a PR research. But of course, that requires a kind of self-awareness in terms of our own position. Okay, so moving on to the final one of these first couple is finally this idea of being proportionate. And again, this has come up already, as you would probably expect. The idea of it being pragmatic. We know it needs to be robust enough and rigorous enough, but also it can't be too excessive. It needs to be proportionate to the scale of what's being evaluated. Yes, it needs to be high quality, but equally we need to be clear about what we are and aren't able to say, and that it's okay not to be able to know everything just because of pragmatic grounds. So over to Beatrice for the other two.
Thank you, Ollie. And something that is very important in terms of, again, the value of going through this kind of exercise, and also the time that the center is taking to package this, is precisely that although the specifics or any single point might feel obvious in some cases, what matters is also getting that full picture. So it's how we help all of us busy with our different hats and our different priorities to get a sense of the interrelation of how there are different dimensions that need to be considered when you engage into an evaluation exercise. No, that's why the importance for us is to how to present this neatly, even if we could always be rethinking, what goes where, which sub-principle might be similar and might be cutting across different themes. We want to be able to offer some kind of memory aid and approaches to visualizations that help us have this fuller picture about what evaluation entails and what the aspiration should be across different areas of priority. So as a fourth theme, and that is quite distinct when we talk about culture, as opposed to the exercises led in other sectors, within health, within education, international aid, was this people-centered angle. This really has emerged very much from all of you, from all the stakeholders. Very, very clearly established that it needed to be a theme and not a subsection. And then starting with, yes, we're talking about being people-centered, that the first angle is this idea of being empathetic. And how are we empathetic when we conduct evaluation? So many of you have raised that in the first part of today. So yes, taking into account what matters to people, and especially to participants and beneficiaries, not to do evaluation to people, but actually to be involving different areas of interest in the process came out as key. This notion of using a range of methods and creative approaches that are tailored to the people, place, and activity that is being evaluated. So moving beyond this idea of imposing something just because it's easy or what is work, into actually switching that out, even if it's harder and it's more complex. We add here those lines of where possible here and there, but actually this should be the ultimate aspiration. The notion of respect as well, respect and trying to enhance the autonomy, dignity, and agency of participants. We believe, again, a very important dimension of evaluation that was not really taken for granted, and at times linked to this idea of evaluation that could be exploitative. So making sure that this is overcome requires that very serious thinking, and again, ensuring that evaluation doesn't diminish or disrupt the experience of participants. All of this, obviously what it does is forcing us to ensure we have the time to engage with complexity. That is not just a shortcut, but if we engage with evaluation in this way that is more principled, it ultimately will be more meaningful and more sustainable. So the different angle emerging here is the many-voiced approach. And it's something we have one of the papers that has been published through the center discussing experiences with evaluation and also proposing evaluation in itself as a co-creative exercise. It very much highlights this idea of seeking, listening to and including different voices and perspectives, and that these ones can scope the evaluation and its purpose, and they can also be included in the reporting and dissemination. So how do we avoid the temptation to provide this falsely unifying authorial stance, something that of course is very tempting because it helps with social media, it helps with the bottom line and the promotion of an idea that will be memorable. If instead we really try to take into account diversity and complexity, how do we manage everyone's expectations and make everyone understand that this is what will raise quality and significance? The other angle is about being socially engaged. So again, the notion of co-creation emerges, and it seems that it's something that is here to stay when we involve different beneficiary groups, also in the way that we define priorities, and not just because they are multiple, but also because they may represent different interests, including the marginalized. The awareness of actually those silent groups that we don't really reach out to, how do we make sure that this is something we are aware of and strive to overcome? So engaging that diversity and trying to enable the self-defined interests from beneficiaries to inform the development of future activities and their evaluation. Again, it's an interesting area to put as something desirable. I keep wondering, how do we make this possible, and what examples exist out there of being able to succeed? But it's really valuable, at least to have it there on paper as something to strive for, as a principle. And linked with this is the idea of being connected, with the first area of emphasis being on transparency. So what does it mean to be transparent in evaluation? It links to the notion of being open, so being very clear about the methods we use, the kinds of data we access, and their interpretation. Very important as well, and this links to this very growing and important debate on failure, that is, let's be able to acknowledge limitations in the evaluation process and the results, and again, strive to share findings publicly. We keep saying where possible, but again, we believe that there should be a way of finding how to share things in one way or another, even if we leave the more extensive details to kind of closer stakeholders. But this is really important, especially with the three areas that are linked to the connected theme, because again, the sharing of information will also help us with this. When we talk about being aware and self-aware, in order to achieve this, we need to have an understanding of the context to the evaluation, what has been done by others. We need to be able to commit to using comparisons and benchmarks, and understand that we need to be able to access the evaluations that hopefully have been published by others, and that's why it's important that we share as well ourselves, and being conscious of our own role, of our position and our agency to see how this might affect evaluation. And again, so finally, the notion of sharing in itself, which links, yes, to the aspiration to just to try to publish as much as possible, to communicate findings, certainly in the first instance with those involved in the project and the activity, welcoming their feedback, making the work, the evaluation available in a variety of formats, and also considering the benefits of conducting joint evaluation activities. Ultimately, the goal is also about pair learning. So is what we keep seeing, that the more you communicate, the more you also engage with other stakeholders, the more you raise your standards, and the more you realize that you are not alone with your challenges and your limitations. So it's less scary to acknowledge them, to put them out there in the public domain. So I hand over again to Ollie to tell you a bit more about what might happen next.
Actually, Beatrice, I'm going to cut Ollie off because I noticed some people are already having to leave. So I'm going to round up very, very quickly. We've just said that the debate in the chat has been really rich, and we will try and make sure we find a way of sharing that. I cannot assure you enough that this is an ongoing process, and there will be lots of opportunities to engage with this debate in a more live and equitable way in the future. So please do sign up. We're going to have a series of debates, already some amazing subjects. I want to do one on the third space and on robustness. Thank you, Annie. Brilliant strand there about that that question as well. So there are new resources going up on our website. There will be a series of debates, and there'll be also some workshops which are looking at the practical living challenges of some of these things, because I hear some of the questions in the chat about how we're actually going to deliver on this. And I just want to leave you with a couple of themes. So how can we think about delivering evaluation as part of a cycle or an ecosystem? Change, pivot, adapt, as our speaker said earlier. How might we create a third space, a questioning culture in which the challenges of evaluation actually land? What does moving from judgment to assessment mean? How do we bring greater emotional intelligence to the way we evaluate and how we attribute value? How do we move to a more intelligent debate about beyond the big bad funder bogeyman? And finally, how do we use the evaluation principles to help us answer all of those questions? So listen, I just want to say thank you so much to all our brilliant speakers, Grace, Kully, Kati, Rishi, Vish, Beatrice and Ollie, and all your work on that. And thank you most of all, and also to you, Trish, for helping us there with the captioning. But I want to say lots of opportunities to engage. Please don't leave us, stay part of this conversation, suggest things we can hotly debate, and please keep in touch. You've all been brilliant. Thank you very, very much indeed. Bye.